Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Illinois Arts Council Agency, and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Illinois Stories. I'm Mark McDonald in Springfield. You know, many visitors and residents of Springfield are very well aware of the Dana Thomas house, the Frank Lloyd Wright masterpiece. Many are less well versed in what happened in and around this neighborhood at about the same time that Susan Dana Thomas was living here. For that reason, the Dana Thomas House Foundation members thought, well, you know, wouldn't it be great if we could put together a walking tour which would not only draw people to the house but also let them know what was going on in the neighborhood. That's what I'm holding in my hand, and that's what we're going to be doing during this 30 minutes. We're going to take a little walking tour around the neighborhood. Cinda Klickna, you and your fellow members thought, well, you know what? There's a big pandemic going on here. People want to be outside. We have one of the greatest draws in the state here, so let's bring them, give them an opportunity to stay outside, enjoy the house and the neighborhood.
Correct.
Yeah, neat idea.
Well, it's been an interesting journey and a lot of research. But, you know, Susan Lawrence Dana lived in that house. In fact, she grew up in a house of her parents, and then hired Frank Lloyd Wright to build this amazing, amazing house. And yet, across the street, we have people who were living here at part of the time. And so we wanted to highlight some of these people and who they were, because they were pretty prominent citizens.
Now, are we talking about this block here, across Lawrence,
yes,
from the house?
This block.
These houses weren't here, of course.
No.
Yeah.
These houses are since around 1930. But originally, when Susan was growing up, there would have been one house here who was on this site.
Okay, on the railroad track site.
Yes,
okay,
was John King, who was a prominent doctor. And he owned most of this block. And then new houses were built, and some really prominent people moved in. In this house, we had a druggist, Fred Roth, who ran his own drugstore. There was a state veterinarian at one time who lived here. There was Tiffany Lansing, who ran his own, well, he was a state veterinarian. There was Lavely, who ran his own dry goods store. So these were people who would have been across the street from Susan, and watching this being built.
This being built.
Yeah.
That cottage over there is interesting too, because that even predates the Dana Thomas house.
Yes,
doesn't it?
yes. That cottage actually stood on the property of the Lawrence family. And then when the house was being redone by Frank Lloyd Wright, they moved the cottage across the railroad tracks. Susan stayed there while the house was being built. And then later in life, when she was getting much older, it was harder for her to keep up the big house. She lived at the cottage. Probably the late 20s that she moved in there.
Legend has it that, you know, she's right on the tracks there, that she had enough pull that the train would stop for her.
Oh yeah.
She
had many people come to her house. She worked for women's rights, and so women would come down from Chicago and they'd all get out right there.
Well, we got a lot of territory to cover,
Okay.
so let's go down to the next block and see what's going on down there.
Very good.
Okay, so we just came down Lawrence and we turned onto 4th Street, and we can see the Dana Thomas house there on that prominent corner, and then right across Lawrence is another big house. This big house was here at the time.
Yes, it was. And as you can see, it's such a great comparison, Mark, between what people were used to seeing architecturally and then what happened when Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright comes to town. And you can only imagine the uniqueness of what they were seeing unfolding right before their very eyes. So very unusual. Matthias Bartle lived here with his wife and 5 children. He owned a boot company downtown. He was one of the progressive business owners that was helping Springfield elevate to a large city. And the 5 children became very close friends of Susan's. Susan, having no children of her own, loved to entertain all ages, and so they were quite often invited over to Mrs. Dana's home.
Oh, that's a sweet story. That's a nice story. And then also, as long as we're on 4th Street here, we can also like sweep across the street. And this home, which is still lovingly taken care of, was also here at the time. Is that right?
Exactly. That's the Conklin home. Mr. Conklin was very good friends with Charles Lindbergh. As a matter of fact, he invited Mr. Lindbergh to spend the night with him on one of his flights into Springfield. And this was right before Mr. Lindbergh became famous with his transatlantic flight in 1927. However, Mr. Conklin was what you would call a progressive postmaster in Springfield. He not only took...
That's how he knew him, because
Yes.
he was carrying mail into Springfield.
Exactly,
Okay.
that was the connection. But he was also concerned that all of the city businesses were scattered throughout the downtown area in different locations, all connecting to City Hall business. And at these locations, they were paying exorbitant rents. So Mr. Conklin said, why not get everyone under the same roof, save the city money, make City Hall something of respect? And so that's what he had a large hand in doing. Also, he was working hard to get the armory built in Springfield at the same time. He was instrumental. To me, the most important thing that Mr. Conklin has done in Springfield to move it forward is purchasing 46 acres over where Blessed Sacrament is. And it was called Hawthorne. And it was a futuristic suburb at that time. Had its own electricity, its own gas, its own water, its own street lights, sidewalks, paved streets. And on top of that, he had them run the streetcar line not only directly through it, but also one close by. So it was really a high-end, progressive place for people to live, moving Springfield forward.
Yeah. Okay, Allison, now let's move down 4th Street toward downtown a little bit. We're looking at what used to be the YMCA.
Yes.
Now it's a vacant lot. It wasn't vacant back in Susan's day, though, because Mr. Hickox had a home here.
Yes, he did.
And he's the same Hickox that built all these apartments on the corner of 4th and Cook.
He was. Interestingly enough, Mark, he purchased the Ridgely home that was on this block where the apartments are now. And with that property came a depth that took him all the way to the railroad tracks. So he decided to erect apartment buildings. The first section of apartments are the ones you see near the tracks. And then in the late 1920s, he built the ones that wrapped around Cook and 4th Street. What was very unusual about them, and this is according to interviews of his daughter years later, that they came with 5-story structure, and cement was used to reinforce the center of the building. I guess his wife used to refer to him as Mr. Cement because he loved to work with it, to the point where he even had his own cement mixer on site all of the time. 5 stories, an elevator, and they had their own ice-producing plant on the property for all the refrigerators in the apartments. They also had their own boiler system downstairs under the basement. And she likened it as a young girl, remembering it as a small city. But what was unusual, the interiors of these apartments were very similar to a private residence. And they were really marketing toward middle and upper middle class people. And it brought some kind of a prestige to apartment living, something Springfield had never seen, especially when it was purchased, built, and marketed by a family high society in Springfield. So it was very alluring for a lot of people.
Yes. Yeah. And right in the shadow of the Capitol.
Exactly.
Okay, Cinda, we're at that same vacant lot where the Y used to be. And when Susan was getting up in years, she found it necessary or wanted to auction off the property that she had obtained throughout her life. And that's what she did on this lot?
Yes. Well, by then Susan was very elderly. She wasn't in good health. And actually an executor was assigned and decided to have an auction. I mean, Susan owned a lot of property downtown, but it was all on paper. So funds were needed. So there was an auction here in July of 1943. It was about as hot as it is today.
Yeah, yeah.
6 days, 2 auctions a day for 3 or 4 hours each time. It was during the war, so there was an air raid one night. All the lights
No
were turned
kidding.
off in the city, so there was a minister here, and he started singing, and they all sang
Wow.
for the time the lights were out.
Yeah.
And the auction started up again.
Wow. So these huge tent, or one
Yes.
or more tents were
There
put
were
up.
2 big tents,
Yeah.
one huge tent with 1,500 chairs,
Wow.
hung with red lanterns. And then there was a smaller tent that had her carriages that were auctioned off. But we are talking jewelry like you can't believe, you know.
Well, jewelry like nobody in
Tiffany-
Springfield had probably seen
right,
before.
Right, a Tiffany necklace with diamonds, christening gown that she had bought during her honeymoon with her second husband. You know, she was 49 when she married her 26-year-old second husband. And unfortunately, he died a year
Yeah,
later.
he passed away quickly,
Yes,
didn't he?
right. But about anything you can think of was sold here. And some of the things just didn't bring what they were worth.
Yeah.
People came from all over the state. And, you know, for instance, her library had something like 2,200 books.
Wow.
Croc and Brentanos in Chicago came. So it drew a large, large crowd every day. But interestingly, all that wonderful Frank Lloyd Wright furniture, the dining room chairs, couldn't even bring 50 cents.
Oh man.
So they were all left back in the house. And really that's why we still have them
That's a
today.
blessing. It's a blessing.
Yes, because the Thomases, who then used the house for their publishing company, took care of all of that furniture.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
It was
Yeah.
quite the week here in Springfield.
Okay, Cindy, we moved a few lots north of the Hickox Apartments.
Yes.
And there's a very old, one of the oldest houses in Springfield, was moved here some time ago. It's in private ownership and it's being restored. That's kind of nice. It's truly a
Yes,
historic
this is
home.
the John Condle house. He owned a shop downtown where Mary and Abraham Lincoln shopped. And this house was actually at the United Methodist Church, and he moved it here in 1852.
So it was down there probably, maybe the parson was, or the reverend was living there maybe, something like that?
I don't really know.
Yeah, but that's where it was.
That's where it was.
Yeah, okay.
And now it's being restored. It has its original glass and fireplaces, and
Sweet.
it's had a lot of work done to
Yeah,
it.
it's still got a lot to go, but I mean, it
Yes.
looks like it's got some bones anyway, right?
Oh yes.
Okay. Now, this stretch from here, and of course the governor's mansion is over across the street here, but here on down to the Baptist church,
Yes.
there was all kinds of building and changes going on, weren't there? Now it's called
Yes.
the Manson View Inn and Suites, but what was here before?
Well, throughout the years it changed. First of all, Joel Mattson, who had been the governor, lived in the governor's mansion, and he didn't like it. He thought it was ugly.
If that wasn't big enough for him either.
When he finished as governor in 1857, he built his own, they called it a palace. Actually,
Yeah.
Mary Todd Lincoln called it a palace.
Uh-huh.
It burned to the ground in 1873.
Well, that's horrible. That's
Yeah,
terrible.
right.
Because it
But
probably
he-
was a palace.
Yeah, it was, and we only have a drawing of it. There are no pictures
Yeah.
that we can find. And then along this block, John Todd Stewart, who is Lincoln's law partner,
Yeah?
lived here. And when you get down to the end of the block, across the street, Christopher Columbus Brown,
Yeah.
who was an attorney, actually married the daughter of John Todd Stewart, Betty. And Betty died in 1869, so he turned the house, his house, into the Betty Stewart Institute, which was a school that existed for 70 years.
In this block.
In this block,
Yeah.
right across the street of Jackson.
Uh-huh.
And Susan Lawrence Dana attended there, and several of the gals growing up in this area attended here. So it was a very prominent, the Betty Stewart Institute.
Yeah. I guess their fires were happening all the time, unfortunately, and the fire departments weren't very good.
Yes.
Is that what happened to Stewart's home? Did it burn down, or do we know what happened to it?
I'm not really sure. I think it might have just been torn down.
And along with the Institute, it may have burned or been torn down. We don't know. Huh?
I'm not really sure.
Yeah. Okay.
More research that we need to do.
That's right. Another book.
Yeah, I guess so. Yes, because we pointed out the houses on Lawrence that burned in 1916, and it started in one of the houses and just spread. And the operator thought she was to send the fire trucks to 4th and Monroe instead of 4th and Lawrence. So there was a bucket brigade, and I mean, it destroyed all of those. The men started the bucket brigade, but yeah, they had fires back then, and supposedly 10,000 people walked by that site. I think that was in 1916. Yeah.
Well, Cinda, the governor's mansion was it was here long before Susan would have lived here, but of course it's been here continuously all that time. She was a friend of governor's, wasn't she?
Yes, very much.
She liked politics, she liked causes, she liked to be involved in civic causes. So she probably spent a good deal of time here.
She was friends with several governors and friends with their wives. Often was a host along with the First Lady. Yes, because she was very active in education and women's rights, Daughters of the American Revolution. One of the things we're trying to do in our booklet and this walk is to try to connect the people, not just to Susan, but to each other. Because many of the women who lived along 4th Street in Lawrence were in the Daughters of the American Revolution. Yeah. And Susan was very active in that. In fact, some of the women who lived along 4th started DAR here in Springfield. So Susan would come here, but she often would host the governor and his wife at her house. There's one where she had a Valentine's dinner, very fancy Valentine's dinner with a lot of people, and the governor would come. Yeah.
Well, okay, so this was built, my recollection is right, 1858. It's been, renovated many times. It's its newest generation right now. It's finished just a couple of years ago.
Right.
But interesting when you said Governor Madison, he lived here and didn't like it very much. He thought it was kind of small and ugly.
Right.
So that's when he built his palace right across the street, right? Which is kind of interesting, kind of insulting too when you think about it.
He had actually gotten the legislature to authorize money for this mansion, and he still didn't like it. So, and this is the 3rd oldest continuously lived in executive mansion in the United States, and on the National Register of Historic Sites.
Yeah, and it is gorgeous. And like I said, I don't know if it's still open for tours. It always has been open for tours, and I assume it will be again. But it's something that people should try to get in to see if there's a way to do it.
Beautiful.
Okay. Well, let's move on.
Okay.
Okay, Allison, now we've moved over around the mansion to 5th Street.
Yes.
And as you can see now, we're on that same block just next to the mansion. And there's another house of interest here which had ties to Susan's life as well, the Lindsay home. Of course, he was a historic figure on his own, wasn't he?
Yes. He was an Illinois poet. And before he lived here, though, Mark, Mary Todd Lincoln's sister, Anne, she and her husband, C.W. Smith, lived on this property, and then the Vachel Lindsay's family purchased it from the Smiths, and he spent the rest of his life here.
The only home he ever lived in.
The only home.
Of course, he did a lot of traveling. He's known as the Prairie Troubadour.
Yes.
He would take these cross-country jaunts, and he would just take a musical instrument and his writing utensils, and he would just perform across the country. People would bring him into their home.
Exactly.
He would stay there, he'd perform and move on. Fascinating.
And he also performed locally because he was a regular visitor, entertainer, per se, at Susan Dana's home right around the corner. So he was well known and well respected in our community and worldwide.
Yeah. He, like you say, his parents, I think his dad was a physician. They bought this home from Mary Todd Lincoln's sister's family.
The Smiths,
yes. The Smiths, right. And then they moved their family in, and I guess he was born here. And like you say, it's the only place he ever lived. And he died here. Now, during that period, I guess there must have been a mushrooming of culture, because you had Frank Lloyd Wright working on a house over there. You had Rachel Lindsay writing poetry over here, and you just had kind of a renaissance. Huh?
Exactly, and I'm still going to go back and credit Susan Dana for spearheading this and providing a venue for this, because her home was never expected to be for family. It was always art and entertainment. And whether it be locally or statewide or nationally, she brought it to Springfield.
The pictures that we've seen throughout, there's not the video, but the still pictures we've seen, have been part of you've done a lot of work on that, and you've had some help, of course, but you and Cindy had a team working on it. And those pictures are available because people helped you,
Yes,
right?
Definitely. And I'm going to credit Doug Carr for doing the photography on all of these venues, because without his volunteer and his assistance and his knowledge and expertise, they wouldn't look as good as they do.
And grant money as well.
And grant money. The Illinois Historic Society, Sangamon County Historic Society, excuse me, provided monies for a grant to carry this out, and we are extremely grateful for that. But during this time of COVID, it was a perfect fit. Get people outside, get them back in their own towns and understanding what went on.
Yeah. And there is, I mean, people know about Rachel Lindsay, people know about Susan, but to give them a chance to put it all in a context is a valuable thing to do.
It's a step back into time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you to you and Cinda for helping us out with
Our
this.
pleasure.
Okay. The self-guided walking tour booklet that I showed you earlier is available if you want to take this tour on your own, and you can get it by downloading it from the Dana Thomas Foundation website, or at the Visitor Center at the Old State Capitol here in Springfield. Just walk in and you can pick one up and enjoy your tour. With another Illinois Story in Springfield, I'm Mark McDonald. Thanks for watching.
Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Illinois Arts Council Agency, and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.